Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in to the very last episode of this series of our new limited series podcast for the Stoke-on-Trent Community Practice, A Shock to the System. I'm Lee Dale, Community Recovery Coordinator for Changing Futures.
And I'm Sophia Fedorovich, the Learning Lead for the Stoke-on-Trent Community of Practice. So across this series, we'll be joined by inspiring guests to have honest conversations as we shine a light on the challenges in practice for people working in the multiple disadvantage field.
A community of practice brings people together to learn, reflect and act. Ours unites frontline workers, people with lived experience and others across health, social care, housing and the voluntary sector, all focused on improving support for people experiencing homelessness, substance use, domestic abuse, health challenges or involvement with the criminal justice system.
We're here to ask tough questions, to challenge assumptions and to share real stories about what works and what doesn't. Our aim is to shift practice, to spark ideas, action and solidarity, whether you're a practitioner, a policymaker or someone currently navigating support.
In this episode, we're discussing co-occurring drug and alcohol use and mental health conditions. We're excited to welcome our guests Kendra Gray and Jason Snape. Welcome to Shock to the System, guys. Could you introduce yourselves and your role for the podcast, please?
Yes, so I'm Kendra Gray. I'm the Chief Exec of the BAC O'Connor Centres and we deliver residential rehab over in Burton, but we also deliver part of the community drug and alcohol team in Stoke-on-Trent.
I'm Jason Snape. I'm a consultant mental health nurse with a particular portfolio around co-occurring needs. And I do casework, I do systems design and I do some systems leadership.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you both with us to explore this topic. So I'm going to kick off with the first question. What are some of the challenges that people experience when accessing support for both mental health and drug and alcohol use? I'm going to start with Kendra.
I think the fact that the system isn't set up for people accessing us, I think we don't work well enough in partnership. I think that it means that people have got multiple appointments at different locations, and I think it makes it really challenging for individuals to actually get the best out of the treatment that both the drug and alcohol services and the mental health services can offer to them, because we haven't changed the system, we're not joined up enough.
Jason?
Yeah, I'd agree. I would expand on that to say there's a problem with timing within systems in terms of what you see from a customer individual perspective is very much along the lines of, well, I am ready now. But the system is geared towards appointments and clinic basis and that sort of thing, and they may give you an appointment at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, which is not the best time for you to get your head together and what have you. So prepared appointments are difficult to access because of logistics and states of well-being, particularly people co-occurring needs, early morning time. But then if you don't make the appointment, we may give you a second one several weeks down the line. And of course, at that point, if you are actually ready to engage and your use is stable and manageable, it may deteriorate during that time. The other problem that comes with that is that if this bouncing off systems continues repeatedly for too long, what ends up, we see from the inside of the system, is people in repeated states of crisis. And they're desperate and they're very emotional, and that's not a fair representation of how they carry themselves usually and what their problems are. So we're just responding to a crisis situation, we're not helping with the overall strategic situation.
Thank you. Next question, guys. So in your experiences, how can mental health and drug and alcohol use influence a person's engagement with services? Start with you, Kendra.
I think, similar to what Jason just said in terms of crisis, I think we're given targets, aren't we, within services, and we're given specific interventions through contracts and service specifications, and you've got to do a series of things. So I think sometimes actually what we might want to do and how we might want to work with people is hindered. So we're not actually giving people what they need at the right time for them as an individual. I think it leads to multiple failures to attend, as Jason's just talked about, because we're not being responsive enough and we're not effective in how we're engaging people. But I'll take it back to my first point. I think the fact that we're not joined up hinders that even further, because if we were more joined up, then we wouldn't hopefully be reaching the crisis point for people, because we'd be able to work with them at the point that they need the service, and we're doing it in a joined up way, which makes it much more effective.
I would agree. I think a couple of points I would raise. One is I saw a very distinct change around the time when the COVID crisis kicked in. because the sheer volume of work that entailed and the number of people who were absent on both sides of the fence, if you like, meant that individual services had to become more efficient and follow a more rationalised internal model. We all became better in our own fields or more capable of dealing with the crisis, but that drew us away from each other rather than knitted us closer together. So that increases the whole sort of merry-go-round thing. The other principal problem from an individual perspective is that these two things are meshed. They're not something that alternates. They're not a binary system. So you initially, your social, your domestic, your well-being problems that may lead you towards substance misuse. Or you may have an underlying condition like depression, anxiety, something of that nature. So you use substances as a way to try and balance that or get away from it. And for a while they work, but then they cause bigger mental health problems because the kickback is more anxiety, paranoia, possibly psychosis. And the two things get locked in, and that thing about sort one first before you sort the other, which is a systems thing, is not helpful for the person who's going through that. You need a whole person view of how to deal with the problem at all angles.
I totally agree with that. I think we have this situation where sort your drug and alcohol problem out and then we'll deal with your mental health, or vice versa. And actually both things need to be worked with together by the professionals in that field, working together to make sure that people can access all the services that they need to respond to what they've got, the problems they've got at that particular time. We've seen that for years, haven't we? And it still happens.
And the legislation, some of which is getting on a bit now, but there has been some new Mental Health Act reforms, is very much in terms of what authority the public sector has to act, is very much geared towards mental health, but not substance misuse, and the word in the Mental Health Act, for instance. So there is legislation around safety and safeguarding around substance misuse that could be used, but it's not specific. And the mental health stuff literally says we cannot detain you and treat you for a substance misuse problem. We can hold you, if it's causing a huge crisis and a risk, but we cannot actually treat you for that under the Mental Health Act. So the legislation is old legislation. Hopefully the new reforms will be more permeable and sympathetic now.
Probably another thing for me as well is around primary care. I think people present at the GP and they don't actually ask the question about drugs and alcohol a lot of times. So people are going in and they're treating it as a mental health problem, but then, as you said, they may be using the substances to mask the mental health problems. That then makes that worse, and we just keep treating it with medicating it through a GP potentially, and people's drug and alcohol problems getting worse, and they're not asking the questions, so they're not getting the help that they need around that, and we just keep going round and round the system.
Absolutely. You happy?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to move us along a little bit more to looking at how we work with people who are having these experiences. So what approaches or skills have you found helpful when working with people who are seeking support for both mental health and drug and alcohol use? I'm going to start with Jason for this one, I think.
The important thing is to the sort of cliche term is to be present, but it is to be focused on the person and what they're communicating. It can be difficult work, emotionally demanding work, but you have to learn to regulate yourself and pay attention. Mirrored body language is very helpful. And if you can get mirrored body language going, there's a thing called cardiac coherence, which I can't get too far into the weeds, is that once that follows, the whole sort of body sort of cardiac system, the adrenaline, that kind of thing, starts to settle towards, if you've got a composed professional, it starts to mimic that. So you get on board with some degree of empathy, some degree of regulation, and then you start to develop trust. And I think then the other thing is not to sell the big picture too hard. You've got to think, okay, so what are we here for? What 2 or 3 things can we look at working on today? Then you look towards, okay, if we get those going, think a little further, what's our strategy? So what skills are you trying to recover? What functions are you trying to recover that you've lost? And then, again, you can look at it in terms of quality of life. So where do you want to be a year down the line? So it's fine to absorb what's going on and get that going, but it is trust and start with simple outcomes that can be deliverable, because that's how the trust continues.
Listening was the first thing that came into my mind, because I think too often we try, again, we've got specific things we need to do, we've got a care plan, we've got a top form, we've got to complete all these things, but actually just listening to what a person needs, I think that's absolutely crucial. I agree with everything that Jason said, and I think utilising people with lived experience is really important across everything that we do, but specifically when you're working with people who've got co-occurring drug and alcohol and mental health problems. I think that can really help support a person through their journey with us. And it is difficult work, but I think it's about, for me, never giving up hope on somebody as well. I think sometimes we forget that those small goals are huge for an individual, and there might be an ideal that where we want somebody to be, but actually it's about what they want and when they want that and how they want that, and supporting them to achieve that goal all the way through their journey with either drugs and alcohol and mental health services.
We're bringing it sort of back down to that kind of basic human stuff.
Absolutely.
There, listening, trust, yeah.
That's what it comes down to. If you look at however more intricate sort of psychological therapy models, it's still two people in one space trying to communicate in a way they understand each other. So that starts with the human connection. The connection is a thing that starts everything. Without that, you more or less as a frontline worker, you're just pushing a sales pitch. And of course, you may have something to offer, but the connection is what makes it livable. The other thing, just explaining what Kendra said about lived experience. The first thing for me is that lived experience for somebody who's new or somebody who's working through a period in their life where they're recovering, lived experience presence is what makes it authentic. So I can be convincing about something in theory, but lived experience makes it authentic to that person. Okay, I've met somebody now that's done this. And if something like, for instance, if I am personally intimately naive towards substance misuse. So I can't comprehend what it's like to come down off opioids or something like that. So somebody that can relate to it, again, we've got that sympathy going. The other thing is that if we come up with what works, it's really lived experience people that stress test whether it works well. So the structure is one thing. The services can provide some kind of structure, but lived experience presence provides the dynamics to actually make it operate.
Move us on then. So we're just thinking ahead a little bit. If you could see one improvement in the way services support people with co-occurring needs, what would that be? And we'll start with you, Kendra.
A joint service, dedicated joint service that works with people. Failing that, and I can't just have one, never, but failing that we are much more joined up as a system, because I think it's the only way we're ever going to support people properly to address the substance misuse and mental health problems, going to different buildings, different locations, timings, all of that. When somebody's navigating all of these issues in their life, for years and years we've tried to do it and it's not working, so I think we've got to do something bold and brave and different. And so my first point would be back to a joint, dedicated specialist service. Failing that, we've got to be more co-located, joined up working.
I would agree with that. I agree with what Kendra says. The no wrong door principle that's coming in, it needs to be that. We have to be careful because if you come and ask me for something, I work in one area and it's actually something you need another, if you're mental health and it's actually housing. Just passing people around is one of the least effective things you can do, because a lot of this comes from trauma, and trauma is a lot about, in terms of your function, in terms of the way you think, the way you feel, it's all fragmented. So if we pass you around in a fragmented way, it just replicates itself, and you'll fail again for reasons that weren't your fault, and it gets harder and harder. Then we talked about trust. If people fail repeatedly, it gets harder to have the motivation and the conviction to get back on board with it. But the other thing is, the other thing through that is, it does need, for work like this, does need somebody who will see you through things consistently, not do everything for you, but give you some sense of emotional holding. And some sense of support as you navigate all this stuff and start to pull it back together. What you have to remember is that a lot of people with substance misuse, a majority I would say, they haven't lived sort of complete, effective lives up to the age of 25 and then suddenly have fallen away from that. These skills and abilities are never developed, so to place the expectation about piles of brown envelopes, how to navigate from one place to another constantly, how to hold it all together because you've got 4 appointments in one day. That is a huge expectation. You do need someone as a guide and a support so that you've got the motivation to continue. Again, we've got that connection thing. I think that's hugely important. Otherwise, we've got a lot of efficient systems that just, it's not carrying the energy.
Yeah.
So that's literally someone who's able to walk alongside the customer to kind of let them know and develop their awareness of what is happening and what processes we're going through, I find is useful to a person. You mentioned those feelings of failure, and I can always remember in recovery and becoming clean from opiates, and I'm thinking, I failed all my life, and you got those feelings of failure, and that small goals thing and getting small wins and victories, building up that confidence and your abilities is a huge thing in recovery, I find.
It is. Trauma is one of my key areas, and what we talk about there is called domains of competence. So if you find that you're capable of doing one thing, like looking after your child or your dog, or there's a hobby or a skill that you have, you break it down. Well, what goes behind that? Put that, break that down to little bits for me. How can we apply that to another area where you're not so confident? But you'll still need the person who's there with you to make that real, to carry that through. Got to cluster things together, and then they'll start to hold with each other. And then you get a bigger picture of yourself. The other thing, this is where I was attempting to go, is you can think this stuff clearly, yeah, but anybody that's gone through a traumatic experience or has experienced shifts in reality through substance misuse, everything starts to waver. And part of that is because you can convince your head, but if you've lived in a survival mindset where you're very aware of everything, it's your nervous system has to believe it, and that takes a longer period of time. Your body's got to go under control. You've got that sense of being clean and self-regulating, because otherwise it's like, well, I want to do this, but I find I can't. And the view from the other side is this person clearly lacks motivation. Yeah. But actually, that's not a motivation thing. That's a trauma survival mechanism saying, don't go there because it didn't work before and bad things happened. So again, there's an element of role modelling, not in terms of being an absolute moral standard, but just as in, this is somebody who stays with me, who can keep themselves together, and I can feed off that, I can mirror that, and then I can keep going with recovery.
I think on your point as well, it's about celebrating those wins. And again, I don't think we do that very well. Recognising it, celebrating that somebody's achieved something, and then empowering them, making sure that you're dealing with the trauma and walking alongside them, just reinforces, I can do this. And if things go wrong, kind of not going, oh, well, it's gone wrong. It's about, okay, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And again, I don't think we do enough of that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that veterans do, and there's a sort of invisible cohort, but veterans have a lot of problems with substance misuse and trauma, marginalisation. But as a collective, they do projects together. They will go and build a barn for charity, or they will do motorbike runs or whatever. And that's also beneficial for them because it's I've achieved something. Yeah. And when you start to waver afterwards, there is a definite thing. It isn't just all about, well, go on, you're your best self. It is literally, look, last week or last month, you went out and did this. That's a fact. So let's get back to that headspace you were in then and try and continue it now.
Cheers, guys.
I'd like to just revisit on a little thing before we move on to the next question, if that's okay. How you brought in much earlier on in this chat about how, someone, it might be that a professional saying this person needs help with their mental health, but it's actually housing that they need help with. I think that especially the space that we're talking about now, multiple disadvantage, quite often that is an underpinning factor. It's, a person's priority isn't always their mental health and their substance use because they're trying to find somewhere to stay. And that's another layer of the system there that's impacting on those people being able to work with mental health and work with drug and alcohol services. Oh,
absolutely, Sophia. If somebody came to me and it was a mental health appointment, it was clear the key thing was housing. I wouldn't say, look, you just need to go out to the council and so on and so forth. Yeah. I would use that time to make sense of that and then call the people in housing and say, well, how does this work if I didn't know already? When I was running a small multiple disadvantage team, I was the only mental health nurse, NHS member, if you like. I had two social care people. I had a social worker and a social care, because so much it was about housing. Without that domestic stability and then a sense of reliable attachment, all that sort of recovery stuff doesn't pull together. You need to be in a safe place with reliable people. If we try and start pushing therapies onto you, or anything like that, then it isn't likely to hold, because if we put you in a therapy space and do a lot of intensive work for an hour, and then you go back and you're homeless, or you're still in a cycle of addiction or something like that, and we do heavy work, all that stuff's going to come out and you've got nothing to hold it other than more misuse.
Linking that to the residential rehab bit, as soon as somebody comes in, it's one of the first things we do. Look at the finances. Have they got the right finances coming in? Have they got somewhere stable to go? Because how can you expect somebody to sit in a group room, talk with a group of people that they've never met, that they're fearful of, that they're apprehensive, they're anxious, and talk about their feelings when they're thinking, where am I going? I'm going nowhere to live in 16 weeks' time. So our kind of recovery academy team, that starts right at the very beginning, and I'm really glad within CDAS now, because of funding that's been made available through housing support grants, we can start to support people with those things, because they're the fundamentals. Nowhere to live, nowhere safe. We can't work with that person fully and support them to fully engage with what we're doing, because they've got nowhere to live. So yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Thanks, guys. So we've got a couple of questions now which we've tailored to your individual experiences. So I'm going to start with the Kendra question, if I may. How does BAC approach coordination between mental health and substance use support, and what lessons or insights have emerged through that work?
So in the two different settings, within CDAS, we now have dedicated dual diagnosis workers, and I think what that's enabled us to do is have lower caseloads so that we can work with people more intensively and link in with mental health services, and that's made a huge difference. I still think there's more we could do. I still think, again, co-location, joined up services would be much better, but I think that's really helped to support the people who have got mental health, substance abuse, and normally they've got either at risk of losing their home or they're homeless. So add that on as well. So that's been really effective. And then within the residential setting, we've had to challenge quite hard around people's postcodes, because they don't all come from the Burton area. So if they go into mental health crisis, we try and get support for them, and that's been difficult. When it works well, it works really well, but it can go spectacularly wrong. And I think that's one of the things that we're talking about, is having those pathways. If I was, as an individual, if I went to Burton and I had a mental health crisis while I was out shopping, I would be looked after. But when somebody's in a residential rehab, I think because of partly stigma, that it's drugs and alcohol. I think partly because they're in a safe place, because we do have mental health nurses, but that's not what our mental health nurses are there to deal with. They're there to deal with detox from drugs and alcohol and support people on the programme. So I think there's this pushback, and it could be due to systems being difficult there because of understaffing, pressures, all those kind of things. But actually, it doesn't help the individual by not having the support they need for their mental health to enable us to continue their programme. So that's one of the challenges that we have.
It's interesting because you mentioned the catchment area thing and the postcode thing, and I know a lot of guys we work with are quite transient, and they'll be going over local authority borders. I've done it myself, so started in Staffordshire, had to go to Newcastle for recovery, recovery. Back into Hanley, then I'm with CDAS, and it's like that kind of break up in continuous kind of care and treatment that takes place.
It's probably one of the most frustrating, because as I say, as a person who's not in services, if that happened to me, I would get that help and support, because they'd have to. But because they seem, and we challenge it, and we are working really well with the mental health provider in the area to try and build the pathways, because otherwise what happens is the person drops out of service and then they come back around somewhere else, and they feel like they failed, and that's not helpful in terms of re-engagement. They feel like we failed them as a service because we haven't got them the help they needed at that particular time. So the lessons for me are that, again, that joined up working, that recognising that it's not knowing either, is it? If the drugs and alcohol are being used to mask the mental health, or the mental health came first, which one came first? That, for me, needs to just go away. We need to stop talking about it. Somebody here has a drug and alcohol problem and a mental health problem. It doesn't matter which came first. We've got to work with both, haven't we? It shouldn't be, well, it's the drug and alcohol, deal with that first. So And I think that's still something that we battle across the services.
I think one of the things I found when we ran a multiple disadvantage service for a while was that in terms of commissioning and that sort of thing, well, it was set up and fine, so there were Bowen's worst Stoke-on-Trent.
Yeah.
The problem is that's all right in May, but when November comes, lots of homeless people, substance problems, and they're all around sort of Hanley, Stoke area. But if more services open up and there's more food and blankets over in Newcastle, people will go that way. That's the level of operating at.
Of course they will.
So it's just a case of we go where the people go. And you have to have that built into your system, I think, for when you work in the community. Obviously, a centre is much more focused. But there is that thing about if you start to hold on to logistics, because there's a lot of variables for people with this sort of culture of substance misuse and homelessness. And some it's quite random. But there are trends within that. So you can think, well, it's reasonable to expect that when you need food and shelter, you will migrate to wherever it is, where's reliable. You know, there are ways of sort of identifying where people will be, and it's literally a bit like putting pins in a map. Well, okay, you know, Dave gets his food here, he gets clean here, you know, and so on and so forth. So you can see where people operate, and you think, well, if that's lost, where else can it be found? So there are ways, but in the actual idea that we operate within a certain geographical catchment area doesn't work, and you have to allow for flexibility, because that's one of the things, the assurances you have to give to get funding. You have to negotiate for that. You go with where the people go.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Got a specific question for you, Jason, if you don't mind. What guidance or practical tips would you share with frontline practitioners supporting people who are experiencing both mental health and substance use needs?
That's a smashing one. Do I pass the interview? Forget that one. Right, I'll tell you what. I would use, when I do supervision around professionals working in this area, this isn't going to answer all your questions, Lee, but I think that I work on an acronym called RACE. So taking it one letter at a time. Relationships is stuff we've already said about trust and engagement and holding people's emotions and what have you. But that has to come first. And I said there's that bit about role modelling, and that won't be about trying to imitate you, but there will be a certain amount of dependency as people come out of the shell. They trust you because the system is fragmented and oversized, and it's hard to trust all that, particularly if you're in a mindset survival driven and sometimes paranoid. But one person I can connect to. So it's being mindful of that. You have to do that kind of emotionally demanding work. You have to work carefully on boundaries. But you have to be open and available and expect a certain amount of dependency as recovery comes through. One of the most alarming things that happens with this is that when you get somebody into a safe space, there's an unconscious hope that it's like, oh, well, I'm here now, so everything's fine, I'm all fixed. But actually, that's the safe time to let it all out.
Yeah.
And if you're not expecting that, you can be overwhelmed. So that comes on to the second point I would make, which is race. The A is about ambivalence and anxiety. So you need to be resilient enough to hold that person's ambivalence and uncertainty, because it's like, well, I've done this half a dozen times before, so all right, maybe I trust you, but I'm already looking at where it's going to fail. And again, that's the survival safety mindset of trauma, regardless of whether you mean well or because you can have people that have very controlled lives. And the message is still the same. I know what's best for you. I'm going to take charge of things. I'm going to walk you through something and make you go through stress. So that thing about you've got to be able to hold somebody's ambivalence and uncertainty in periods of anxiety, well, that's going to project onto you, but that's the key thing about making progress. So you've got the connection. That's the next thing about making progress. Should I go here? How are you going to carry yourself? And so on. Once that works, you're looking at collaboration. And that's stepping away a little from direct work with your customer. But that is about trying to run a thread through those services, advocating for them, but also sharing information. And I think that's one of the problems is, of course, we've all got different business systems, different record-keeping systems, but that still puts it onto us. We should find a common language. Because otherwise, simple terms like risk get wildly out of control and they fail. Yeah. Because it won't be about how do we share the risk, it'll be about who's best at holding it. Oh, you know Dave really well, don't you, mate? You know, and that comes in. So that collaboration should be systemic, that open door bit. It's important. And then the last thing for race is E for emotions, which is a little, but that thing about your own self-management, self-care, is supervision's a must. This is demanding work. This is explosive work, and people are themselves unexpectedly, they can be unreliable, they can be difficult to predict, but your reliability and your predictability is what builds safety. So you need supervision because all that burden is coming onto you, not just your emotions, but the other person's, you know, the risks that they run and so on. So there's different forms. There's managerial supervision, which is if you've got a caseload to make sure you're not doing anything too risky and that you not get too many people. There's clinical supervision, which is where you've got a senior or a mentor that helps you get everything off your chest, and you should be as natural and authentic about your language as you can be, because if you don't get that demanding stuff out, if there's times when you feel tired and frustrated, if you mask that, it will just sit and build up and you'll get more and more defensive and demotivated about your job, so that cleans you out. And then you've got team supervision, because again, that's how the collaboration starts. That's how you share ideas about, well, actually the best approach for Pete is to go this way. Yeah? And you learn off each other as examples, and you role model each other, and that feeds back. So that's the usual way I break that down, if that makes sense.
Okay, so we covered a lot of ground today, and I hope the conversations have given you plenty to think about. A big thank you to our guests, Kendra and Jason, for sharing their thoughtful insights. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you to the people and partners who've made this podcast possible, so including Changing Futures, the National Lottery Community Fund and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. This is our last episode of this series, but until we meet again, you can keep the conversation going by visiting the Expert Citizens website and going to the Community of Practice Resource Bank, where you'll find lots of resources to help support you in creating your own little pocket of systems change.